All right, let's dive in, shall we? Today, we're going somewhere you might not expect.
Oh, where are we headed?
Ancient Arabia.
Arabia. Interesting. What's in Arabia?
Well, believe it or not, a Jewish kingdom once thrived there.
A Jewish kingdom. I don't recall ever learning about that.
It's not widely known, but it's a fascinating story. And, get this,
Yeah.
it's actually connected to some of the tensions we see in the region today.
Like what?
You sent me some really interesting sources that look at the conflict between Yemen's Houthis and Israel.
Right, right.
And they use that as a jumping off point to explore this little known piece of history.
So we're going back in time to understand the presence. I like.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. The Himyarite kingdom.
Okay.
They weren't always Jewish, were they?
No, they weren't. The early Himyarites, they worshipped a solar goddess.
Huh.
And they had this bustling trade relationship with Rome.
Before Rome became Christian.
Exactly. Pre-Christian Rome. But then, when Rome converted to Christianity, things changed.
It sounds like that shift in Rome had a huge impact on Himyar.
Oh, absolutely. It led to a near-complete halt in trade between the two.
Really? So it wasn't just a religious difference. There must have been some economic factors there, too.
Right. It's likely a combination of things. Religious differences, sure, but also, well, you have to consider the growing influence of Christianity in neighboring kingdoms, like Aksum, modern-day Ethiopia.
Right.
So the Himyarites were kind of caught in the middle of all that, between these two expanding Christian powers.
So, converting to Judaism, under King Melkakarib Yuhamin in the late 4th century AD,
Right.
it was more than just a spiritual change, wasn't it?
You could say that. It was probably a strategic move, too.
To distance themselves from the Christian world that was closing in on them.
Exactly. Adopting Judaism, making their state religion, it was a way to assert their independence, to create a distinct identity.
In a world that was rapidly changing around them, it makes sense. But then things get a bit darker, don't they? Because we start to see the persecution of Christians within the Himyarite kingdom.
Yeah, unfortunately.
It's something that really surprised me when I was reading those sources.
Me too.
We tend to think about religious persecution in other historical contexts, but this one,
It's not as well known.
right, it just highlights how widespread those conflicts really were.
And complex.
So how did it start, this persecution?
Well, there were incidents like the execution of a Christian priest,
Azakir.
Osgir,
Yeah.
in 410 AD. He built a chapel, adorned it with a cross, and they executed him for it.
Wow. One of the sources mentioned that he might be recognized as a saint by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church.
It's possible.
Really shows you how far-reaching the consequences of these events were.
Absolutely. It's a long-lasting impact.
A reminder that religious intolerance, it leaves its mark. But this persecution, it really escalated under King Du Nuaz, didn't it?
Oh, yes. He was a powerful figure. Ruthless, really. By 500 AD, he had expanded Himyar's control over much of the Arabian Peninsula.
A formidable king, by the sounds of it, but with a dark side.
Yes. He's known for his brutal campaign against Christians.
Du Nuaz, he really intensified the persecution that had begun decades earlier. And it culminated in that horrific massacre at Najran.
A truly chilling event. Both Christian and Islamic sources describe widespread torture and killing. Just awful.
Up to 10,000 people may have perished in that massacre, according to the sources you sent.
It's hard to even imagine.
One of the texts, Holy Women of the Syrian Orient, it gives this incredibly vivid account of the martyrdom of Rum and her daughters.
Right. I remember that.
It's a difficult read, but it really brings the brutality of that time to life.
Yes, it does.
Such a stark reminder of what unchecked power, what religious zealotry can lead to. And this massacre, it sent shockwaves through the region, didn't it?
It did. And eventually, it led to the Byzantine Emperor Justin I calling for intervention.
He appealed to the Ethiopian king Caleb.
Yes. Urged him to invade Himyar, put a stop to the bloodshed.
So we have this clash of civilizations brewing, the Byzantines, the Ethiopians, against the Himyarites. Was King Caleb's decision to invade purely driven by religion?
It's hard to say for sure, but, well, Himyar was strategically important. Whoever controlled Himyar, they controlled key trade routes. They had a lot of influence in the Arabian Peninsula.
So it was a mix of religious and strategic motivations.
Most likely. It often is, isn't it?
It seems like it. This sets the stage for a pretty dramatic showdown, and I'm really curious to hear what happens next. But before we move on, is there anything else about the lead-up to this conflict that stands out to you?
Well, one thing to remember is that this wasn't just a local conflict. It had much wider implications. The Byzantines, the Persians, They saw the rise of this powerful Jewish kingdom as a threat.
So it was adding another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation.
Exactly.
It seems like we're only just scratching the surface of this story.
We are. There's so much more to uncover.
And I can't wait to dive deeper. Okay, so let's get back to it. Last we left off, we had this massive clash brewing in 6th century Arabia, King Caleb of Ethiopia.
With his army of 7,000 men.
Right, they were on their way to intervene in Himyar. What happened when those forces met?
Well, the Ethiopians won. Decisively.
So they crushed Dunuis and his forces.
They did. And with that, the Himyarite kingdom, at least as it had been, came to an end.
The sources mention some pretty terrible things happening afterward, though. Forced conversions, massacres.
Yeah, unfortunately, peace often comes at a heavy price. You see that throughout history. One conflict ends, but it leads to more violence, more upheaval.
In this case, the Ethiopian conquest really changed the religious and political landscape.
It did. Reshape the whole region.
What about Dunuis? What happened to him?
It's actually a pretty dramatic story. He didn't want to be captured, wouldn't submit to the Ethiopians.
So what did he do?
He rode his horse right into the Red Sea.
He killed himself.
Yes. Chose death over surrender.
Wow. That's intense. It's almost like something out of a play. A king facing defeat, choosing to die rather than give up. Do you think it was out of despair? Or defiance? Maybe he wanted to be a martyr.
It's impossible to know his true motivations, of course, but it shows how strong his convictions were.
He was a complicated figure, Dunuis, a ruthless leader, responsible for a lot of suffering, but also incredibly devoted to his beliefs.
Absolutely. He was willing to fight for them, literally to the very end.
And then there's King Caleb, the Ethiopian king. He orchestrated the downfall of Himyar.
He did.
And he's actually venerated as a saint in the Orthodox Church, right?
That's right.
What happened after he conquered Himyar?
Well, after his victory, he went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, laid down his crown at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Wow.
And then he gave up his throne, became a monk, dedicated the rest of his life to religious pursuits.
That's an incredible change. From conquering king to humble monk. I wonder what was going through his mind. After all that violence, all the upheaval he'd seen, do you think he was trying to atone for his actions? Or was it more about securing his legacy as this righteous ruler?
It's really interesting to think about, isn't it? What caused such a drastic shift? Was it a genuine spiritual awakening? A desire to make amends for the past? Or maybe, as you said, a calculated political move?
Whatever the reason, it just adds another layer to his story.
It does.
So we've covered the rise and fall of the Himyarite kingdom. We've seen how brutal these religious conflicts could be. And we've talked about the motivations of these key players like Dunuis and King Caleb.
Right.
But there's one more thing I want to explore before we wrap up. This question of Jewish identity. In the context of the Himyarite kingdom, it gets pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah. The sources really make you think about what it means to be Jewish. The relationship between belief, ethnicity, cultural identity, it's all there.
One of the authors even asks directly, were the Himyarites truly Jewish? They practiced the faith, had synagogues, rabbis.
But they didn't have that ancestral connection to the Jewish people that we often think about.
Exactly. And the author makes this comparison to the Khazars, that Turkic group who converted to Judaism.
It reminds us that identity is complicated. It's not always clear-cut. The Himyarite example, it challenges our understanding of what it means to be Jewish, shows the diversity of Jewish experiences throughout history.
It really makes you question those simple categories we often use to understand history and culture. And then there's this whole concept of logos that the author brings up.
Ah, yes.
Could you explain that a bit? I'm not sure I fully grasp it.
Sure. In this context, logos represents that divine order or reason that you often see associated with Christianity.
Okay.
The author's arguing that Judaism, at its core, is a rejection of that logos, specifically its embodiment in Christ. It's a fundamental difference between the two faiths.
So being Jewish is partly defined by its opposition to Christian theology.
That's the argument the author's making.
It's a pretty provocative idea. It makes you think about interfaith dialogue, whether it's even possible to find common ground when there are such fundamental differences.
It definitely challenges us to move beyond those simple binaries, to see the nuances in religious thought. And the Himyarite example, with its mix of Jewish and Arabian traditions, it reinforces that idea.
Every time we dig into one part of this story, it just gets more complex.
It does.
I have to say, this deep dive has been really eye-opening.
It's a fascinating topic.
It is. I'm going to be thinking about this for a while. You know, it's interesting. We tend to look at history in terms of winners and losers,
Right.
but with this Himyarite kingdom, it doesn't feel that simple. It's not so black and white.
No, it's not. It's more about understanding what motivated people, their beliefs, the circumstances they were in, what led them to make the decisions they did.
Exactly. And the Himyarites, with their religion, their politics, their culture, it all mixes together to create something really
It
complex.
does.
And it shows us that even events that happened centuries ago, they can still be relevant today.
Absolutely.
We started this deep dive talking about the Houthis in Israel, and now we've gone all the way back to this Jewish kingdom in 6th century Arabia.
It's all connected.
It is. The Himyarite story reminds us that history is never truly in the past. It's always influencing the present, shaping what's possible in the future.
I agree.
So, to sum up our journey,
Yeah.
we've explored the rise and fall of the Himyarite kingdom, their conversion to Judaism, their relationships with their neighbors, and ultimately their demise. We've looked at these fascinating individuals, King Nunuwas with all his ambition and brutality, and King Caleb, who defeated the Himyarites and then chose a life of solitude and reflection.
It's quite a story.
It really is. And along the way, we've had to grapple with these big questions about identity, power, the effects of conflict. The Himyarite kingdom, it might not be a well-known chapter of history, but it tells us so much about the human experience.
It does, both the good and the bad.
One of the most important lessons for me is the importance of questioning our assumptions.
Oh, absolutely.
The Himyarites, they force us to rethink what we thought we knew about Jewish identity, about religious conflict, about how we interpret history itself.
History is rarely as simple as we think it is. It's made up of so many different perspectives, so many different stories, and we have to be open to all of them.
This deep dive has been a real journey, and I know I'll be thinking about it for a long time to come. Any last thoughts you'd like to share with our listener?
I would just say keep an open mind. Don't try to force this story into a neat little box. The Himyarite kingdom, like so much of history, is a puzzle with missing pieces.
Yeah.
And it's those gaps, those uncertainties, that make it so intriguing.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into the Himyarite kingdom. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring.